I'm excited to present this Expert Insights webinar, After Action Report, 5 Lessons Learned from the Events of 2013. In this webinar, our presenters will discuss and examine major crises and emergency events, strategies used, lessons learned, and best practices going forward. After the session, we will have a 10-minute Q&A with our speakers. As a reminder, you can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. You may send your questions by typing in the open text field in the questions panel and sending your question to all panelists. If time runs out before your question is asked, we will try and follow up with you after the webinar. Links to the recording of the webinar and slides from today's presentation will be available on our blog within a few days of today's session. You can also look for a link to recordings for all of our webinars on everbridge.com under our resources section. If you're on Twitter, we encourage you to take a moment and follow us at Everbridge and use the hashtags #Everbridge and #CrisisCalm to share snippets of insight throughout our program with your followers. We'll even retweet some of your comments. And now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Our first speaker is Robert C. Chandler, PhD. He's internationally known as an author and communication expert specializing in crisis and risk communication. His expertise in communication issues related to disaster crises has been taped internationally by government, health, and community agencies, as well as corporate enterprises. As the director of the Nicholson School of Communication at the University of Central Florida, Dr. Chandler also convenes the annual International Crisis and Risk Communication Conference on the UCF campus in Orlando, Florida. The 2015 ICRC conference, which is to be held March 2nd to the 4th, 2015, on the theme of accountability, metrics, and critique. Dr. Chandler earned his PhD at the University of Kansas, his master's at Wake Forest University, and his BA at Harding's College. He's an award-winning author of 9 books, including Emergency Notification, Pandemic Business Continuity Planning Priorities for the Coming Outbreak, and Surviving the Pandemic, a Communication Management Guide for Business. Professor Chandler is the source of widely used models and methods for crisis and emergency communication, including his groundbreaking 6 Stages for Crisis Communication Planning, Message Maps 2.0, the 3-3-30 principle for emergency incident notification, and the 60 and 6 rule for communication messages. After Dr. Chandler, we will hear from Bill Shara. And Dr. Chandler, I'm going to hand it off to you now. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I thought you were going to talk more about Bill. My apologies. I was waiting to hear all of the accolades there in terms of that. Sorry about the delay. Thank you, Mike, Bill, all the guys there. Thank you so much for asking me to come in, and we professors like to profess, so this is always fun. It's the time of year where if you tune into any news magazine show or website or CNN or anywhere, that you're going to begin to see, if not already, but probably in another couple of weeks, lots of year-in review stuff. There's going to be a lot of talk about 2014. There'll be top 10 lists. There'll be things that happened. And, you know, it's about that time of year. Before we dive in, though, to putting 2014 to bed, I wanted today to talk a little bit about 2013. As we did last year about 2012, I want to look back before we completely lose every bit of what we learned in 2013. And before we dive in, as I'm sure we will at some point in the future, looking at 2014, the great essayist George Santayana wrote a line that is often quoted, and I hope I quote it correctly. I'm trying to do this from my head, but I think what he wrote was, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And I'm sure you've heard some variation of that very insightful statement, and then we could debate that and talk about it. But today's session is really devoted to the spirit or the idea behind that statement, that we really should learn from what happened, what didn't happen, what went right, what went wrong, as we think about what's going to come next. And frankly, I don't know of any better foreshadow. When someone says, I have a crystal ball, here's what's going to happen in 2015, these are the kinds of threats and crises and challenges that we're going to face. Frankly, I don't know any better crystal ball than looking back, because I think the past really is a worthwhile area to do an after-action review as we look forward to how we're going to prepare for other events. And so that's really the spirit of this. And first of all, I also feel like I'm the bearer of bad news, because I'm going to focus on some terrible things that happened in 2013. There were wonderful things that happened in 2013 as well. But I think for our learning purposes, I want to go through, I hope each of these will jar your memory, which is the point, and to think, gee, I should be thinking about that or something specific. And the final caveat I'll say is that every single one of the kinds of things that happened in 2013 probably deserves their own individual case study. In fact, we should probably do white papers and webinar series on every single one of these. We could probably just focus for the next 5 years on 2013 because so much went on in that year. I am just going to group them into 4 broad categories. I could have grouped them into other categories. You probably have a better category system. I wouldn't debate with you. But in terms of crisis, disaster, incident notification, in terms of the real communication challenges, I kind of grouped 2013 into 4 categories. And let me just talk about each of those and try to give some observations. My guess is that you will have yourself insights far beyond the wisdom that I have just as we review them. But I want to talk about the mass murder, mass shootings that happened in 2013, the general topic of terrorism, of course, natural disasters. 2013 is a spiky year for natural disaster. And I'd thrown in product safety recalls. I myself had sort of forgotten that 2013 was a year of dangerous products and trying to get the word out about them. So, you know, let's kind of look at them. I'm going to start with some grim things. 2013 was regrettably yet another year of more and more that couldn't happen here. I'm shocked, I'm stunned. Who would think this would happen? Mass shootings, shooting sprees, mass killings, mass murder. Of course, the year began, I know it's not 2013, but when I look back at the news headlines in January of 2013, they were all covered with the discussions, the analysis, the discussion, the hand-wringing, the what do we do next, from the December 12th Sandy Hook, Connecticut shooting. And in fact, that was an elementary school. I don't know, that itself is a sad event. And so when I went back and started just searching through the headlines of each month of the year, that was really a story in January 13 that how could we prevent this? Should we have done better? There's a lot, by the way, of comm analysis, notification, law enforcement, parents, media, constituents, students. There's a lot of communication things that were going on, and as the year began, really worrying about it. But the year wasn't over, of course. There were, I found a number of incidences. I'm just going to mention 3 of them because each of those had their own takeaways in different areas. The April mass shooting in Belgorod Oblast in Russia was perhaps one of the most significant events that spring in terms of yet another mass shooting. And those of you who hasn't jogged your memory to remember that we had an assailant, an angry, upset individual who took a semi-automatic rifle. He went to a business, oddly enough, a gun store, which is a whole other separate webinar. There's some irony there. Went in, shot up the store, then went out and began shooting any shopping patrons on the sidewalk in front of the store. I think that there were a total of 6 people that were gunned down that day, and of course spurred yet another round of public safety, public space safety discussions. That summer we had 2 more very significant events, and the first one was, the next one was in June. This, of course, was in Southern California. We have a domestic dispute where there is a shooting, and then the person fleeing the shooting continued to shoot. As he drove down a public street, he moved towards and then eventually onto the campus of Santa Monica College. It ended up in a last stand shooting in the library of there. I think we had a total of, again, 6 bystanders, 6 people that were put into risk and murdered that day. I think there were 4 others critically wounded. Most of you probably remember the media coverage, and of course with that one as well, questions ranging from the city to the college, notification, monitoring, social media played a major role. And then in July, also in Hialeah, Florida, we have yet another mass shooting incident. We have an individual who actually first set fire to an apartment building and then laid in wait for people to flee the fire in the burning building and then began shooting. I think, again, we have 7 murdered victims happening there in that shooting spree, the related fire, the neighbors, the public space. There's a lot the more I could say. I guess the point is that every time the next incident happens, we have the same conversations about it couldn't happen here. I'm stunned, I'm surprised. One of the takeaways is that this kind of threat is there. There's some great reports, and I shouldn't mention it because it came out in 2014, but there's some great analysis that came out this year that it's not just coverage of these events. There appears to be in real time an increase in these incidents, and of course no one knows exactly why, and there's much speculation. From our standpoint, safety in public spaces, safety in schools, office buildings, and yes, post offices, and that becomes now something that we really, if you haven't begun to prepare for the whole active shooter, armed shooter scenarios, if you haven't thought through your communication plans for that, 2013 is a object point that these events are happening. Terrorism, of course, when I went back and kind of skimmed through 2013 from a communication standpoint, there were other acts of terrorism worldwide, and there are some places where there were acts of terrorism each week of 2013, and so there's no shortage of them. 2 of them jumped off the page for those of us that are planning for critical emergency incidents and things. One, of course, is the Boston Marathon bombing. You could not talk about 2013 without mentioning the race finish line bombing. I'm sure everyone tuned in here knows only too well the episodes that happened, the bomb on Boylston Street, I think there was a manhunt, there was eventually more shooting, there were people injured. I think three immediate fatalities. By the way, some of the injuries are horrific. I think involving hundreds of others, the disruption. In fact, there's many things about the bombing, however, that worked well. And one of the things that we learned in that was preparedness, readiness, being available to have a quick network. There were, as horrific as it was, there were some fortuitous parts of it. The marathon bombing in 2013 still is a worthwhile case study. And in fact, I think any of these are worth revisiting. The other thing in 2013, when I began to think back, what about terrorism for planning purposes, obviously what happened at Westgate Mall in Nairobi, Kenya, where we had a group of 4 assailants that basically laid siege to a shopping mall, attacking customer shopkeepers, and essentially taking hostage an entire shopping center. And if you recall, that was a 4-day ordeal. I think we have a total, and again, there are people injured, and as I recall, more than 70 people murdered in that attack. Hundreds of others were injured, and I can't even tell you the countless thousands that were affected by it, loved ones, family, neighbors, connections, of course, business operations. And of course, the final analysis after the gun battle, after the attacks, after everything, the damage to the mall, eventually 3 stories of the mall eventually collapsed. And it reminds us once again of public space events, of those of you who have accessible buildings, and particularly with large groups of people. It expands our thinking to parades and carnivals and shopping centers and shopping malls and corporate campuses, and of course those of us in the university campuses, that the idea of those threats. 2013 was, if we haven't had one already, a wake-up call to those kinds of threats and the need for preparedness. There were also a number of foiled terrorist plots. Now, these actually may have drifted from your memory, but it's kind of frightening as I was going through the headlines. The foiled plots in 2013 included at least 3 of them that are worth mentioning. One, of course, was a well-planned attack that was going to either destroy or derail via Rail Canada trains, particularly those that were linking Toronto and New York City. Their goals when they were uncovered and this plot was disruptive were quite simple. They wanted to kill as many people as they could, destroy as much property as they could, but also to terrorize and disrupt travel, disrupt business and transportation operations. And so obviously a public horrific plot was hatched, but also the idea that they wanted to really disrupt business and the economy and operations and things. It's once again the idea that they're still out there, they're still a threat, are very real. Another one you may have forgotten is that, and I think it's been actually downplayed by the government, so maybe I shouldn't be mentioning this, but we have in the late spring, on again in June, a series of poison mailings that were going on. We've seen poison was put into envelopes and letters. They were mailed to government officials. Some were even sent to the president. These kind of things were disrupted. They didn't reach anyone. They didn't harm anyone. They were discovered. But the idea of vigilance certainly is there. And, of course, the Wichita Airport plot, you have a person who became radicalized, I think is the word we use these days, and he had read some extremist material on the Internet and had decided that he should become a suicide bomber, and he designed his explosive vest and his explosive materials, and he had access to going to the Wichita, Kansas airport, where he planned to detonate himself. And luckily, again, that plot was broken. So what are the lessons learned? There's probably a long list of them. But the idea that these kind of things happen, and they don't always happen. Well, I don't know that Wichita would have occurred to any of us when we were trying to look at the most vulnerable places. And I'm not sure where you're at, and you're pretty sure you're not vulnerable, but I'm just not sure anymore that we can assume that. And the idea of being prepared is so very much important. Now, I'm not sure it's any better news, but let me get away from mass murder and terrorism. As I look back at 2013, I think it would be fair to call it the year of natural disasters. When I was looking at events that involved major communication, weather events, natural disaster events dominated. And so let me just kind of talk about, I want to talk about hurricanes and earthquakes and severe weather and some different things, but let me just start with hurricanes. I live in Florida, so that's where I want to start. Here on the Atlantic coast, 2013 was actually a fairly mild season. We had fewer storms, and they weren't all that big deals. That same year, however, on the other side of the planet, they had numerous and very devastating storms. And so, first of all, the unpredictability. It could be a mild year, it could be a devastating year, it could be both, just in different places. It doesn't take you long. Go thumb through the major devastating hurricanes, and you're going to quickly find a pretty significant list in terms of property damage, disruptions, flooding, storm surges, wind damage, business disruptions. And 3 of them hit Mexico, and we may have some business connections there today. The other is the Philippines and India. And those kinds of devastating storms once again reminded us of how disruptive they can be to people, to lives, safety, property, and business operations, but also the idea of keeping people informed. And so, yeah, we've just kind of begun. We've concluded hurricane season in Florida this year, and I think if I just kind of early forecast, I think we're going to find, at least in the Atlantic, 14 was a fairly mild season, but it remains that 13 reminds us of both of these events. 2013 was also a year.
Hi, it seems like Dr. Chandler is having some technical issues. We're going to switch over to Bill Shara. He's going to be the presenter, and when Dr. Chandler comes back on, if he comes back on, we'll try and continue his portion of the presentation. But just for the sake of your time, we want you guys to get all the information as possible. So as of right now, I'm going to switch it over to Bill Shara, Learning Officer and Worldwide Best Practices at Everbridge.
Good day, everyone. This is a clear example of why you can never be sure when a disaster is going to hit you, or what's going to happen. As soon as I hear Dr. Chandler coming back on, I'm going to jump off, and I'll finish whatever I'm going to do, because we definitely want to hear what he has to say, and I'm going to be talking about some of the best practices and things that he learned later. So if you don't mind a cart in front of a horse, we'll go ahead and start getting going. Okay. One of the things that he's been talking about has been preparedness remains king. This is the kind of thing where you don't want to have a surprise. This is not something you can do at the seat of your pants. You've got to be able to plan and prepare. For those of you who are in administration, you don't want to have the people who are there have the crisis plus the worry of what am I going to do, what am I going to say. How do you work on preparedness? Well, one thing you can do is set up templates for the incident. What incidents are relevant? Which ones can I start to prepare for? Who do I need to notify? Who has to be known? You don't want to guess at this, and you don't want to be sure. Who am I going to notify? And how will I notify them? What sorts of things can I do to make sure that they're getting it? I don't want to use just one modality, because if that modality is down, it's trouble. If it's a hurricane, it might be difficult to get a landline. There could be problems even with Wi-Fi and different kinds of internet. So I want a variety of ways to get there. And I have to decide in my organization which is the most efficient. So I want to use SMS for speed. Do I have some other applications that I can use to be able to do that? How will you notify them is important. And then you can do settings for how quickly you're going to notify them. When will you send them another notification? Now that supposes that you've got a way to get a confirmation back that says, I got it, so that you don't keep bothering them. But you might want to be able to do it, and especially, again, when you've got bad conditions. When will the landlines be back up? When will you have Wi-Fi again? When will mobile be? You want to be able to have the opportunity to continually send out until you can get the people reached. And it depends, again, on what the nature is of what's there. But you want to be prepared. Not only do you want to be prepared for the incident, but you also want to be prepared for what you're going to say exactly. This is one of the key things. Those of you who've read Dr. Chandler's book on emergency notification, those of you who've seen the 6 stages, can realize that you need a series of messages, and those messages must be tailored to the situation. Short, instructional, that'll give what's there. Actionable, they know what's going on. This is not the time to be confusing, and so you want to prepare the messages that you're going to send. You want to be sure also that those in your organization have, or institution, have agreed that this is what we want to say. And now with a template that's there, you can make minor changes to it, but it's much faster. And then how do you want to say it? We talked about the different modalities. Well, you've got the ability to be able to say, I want to record voice. I want to use text-to-speech. I want to have the ability to modify my emails to show branding to help people recognize what's there. I also want to make sure that they can see that this is emergency message by branding even my voice recordings with the keywords they've got to hear. Dr. Chandler does a wonderful job on message mapping and also on how you put the message together with this 3330 plan that's there. And I'd recommend for those who haven't seen it, take a look at both. It's absolutely critical to plan. Preparedness is the king. You don't want surprises. Okay. I hear that Dr. Chandler is back, so let's go to the expert.
Thank you, Bill.
Hi there. Hi there.
There you go, Dr. Chandler.
That's great. Do you know where my stuff cut out? I don't know. I kept going for a long time there.
Yeah, one slide back, Dr. Chandler.
All right.
Right.
So let me just pick up with Bohal, and yeah, I saw at one point that the presenter switched, and then I still had audio. I felt it showed audio on my screen, but anyway, I love technology. I'm glad I work with these technology guys because I'm totally naive. Okay, I said some wonderful things. You missed them. Sorry. The Bohol earthquake is really, again, I said earthquakes could be called the year of earthquakes. I want to zoom in on it because Bohol was a dramatic event. It devastated in the Philippines, was very devastating. More than 200 individuals were killed. 1,000 or more were seriously injured. Tens of thousands more suffered without utilities, without power, without protection, without structures, without water, without food, without medical supplies. 15,000 buildings were completely destroyed. I can't even tell you how many businesses disrupted. Tens of thousands more were damaged and unable to be occupied or used. It was one of the most devastating earthquakes in the Philippines and one of the deadliest in more than a quarter of a century. So much was learned in the earthquake disaster at Bohol. It is another great case study to look at the implications for communication planning, for coordination. Without power and electricity, it's an interesting study, and the persistence of some social media. It's a fascinating case study. The earthquake itself would probably make the list dramatically and be a major point for 2013 because so much was learned about it. The kicker is that the earthquake itself, as devastating and as dramatic and as deadly as it was followed 3 weeks later by Typhoon Haiyan. And the very same islands and cities and places that had been completely devastated by the earthquake were then completely obliterated further by this tremendous hurricane, well, typhoon in the Pacific, that comes ashore. Tens of thousands of people had to endure the hurricane in temporary tent and refugee shelters and evacuation camps, and some without that. And so what little limited response was still happening from the earthquake 3 weeks later was further just completely eliminated, and the problems exacerbated and everything. In fact, the earthquake relief efforts themselves became a crisis communication incident. If you want one natural disaster to tell you of every communication snafu and coordination snafu, both in terms of intelligence, situational awareness, information distribution, if you go to Bohol and you look at the earthquake combined with Typhoon Haiyan, you've got a case study. You have something here that you can debrief for months about just how bad things could go wrong. And it's not one disaster, it's multiple. And so from my standpoint, nothing is more dramatic that year. While more lives may have been lost elsewhere than the hundreds who perished here, it certainly is devastating. The other thing with natural disasters, I think I've said what you can call this the year of earthquakes, call it the year of hurricanes. It could also be called the year of tornadoes. Approximately 1,000 tornadoes were reported in the U.S. alone. Of those, more than 800 have been confirmed that they were in fact tornadoes. More than 100 people died in tornadoes worldwide in 2013. About half of them died here in the United States. Yes, if so far you're pretty sure earthquakes and hurricanes and typhoons are not in your communication plan because they don't need to be, I would certainly say we learned lessons about twisters in 2013. Among the ones, all right, now these will jog your memory. In February, I say that again, in February, an EF4 tornado struck Hattiesburg, Mississippi. There were, I think, 8 tornadoes in Mississippi, Alabama that same day. The Hattiesburg was, of course, a devastating tornado. Many of you remember the kind of disruptions it caused, the damage, the buildings, communication problems. It was a federal disaster area. State of Mississippi issued a state of emergency. The February Hattiesburg tornado is worth the debriefing. Just a couple of months later, of course, the horrific Moore, Oklahoma tornado in May struck. That was an EF5 twister. That means what? Wind speeds 210 miles an hour or greater. 24 people died in the initial striking of, I think, goodness, 400, 500 more injured seriously. But that only began a series where you have now, within days of each other, at the end of May, the El Reno, Oklahoma tornado, which, by the way, was the widest recorded tornado in history. It was basically about 2 miles or so across. It's just 2.5 miles across. Hattiesburg, Moore, Oklahoma, El Reno. You know, all of these were part of larger weather systems that themselves produced damaging winds, hail, flooding, and you know, and some of these are just really beyond description. In fact, in El Reno, Oklahoma, I think I have it on my slides, nearly 300-mile-an-hour measured wind speed. I can't even begin to think what that was. In fact, the thing that most of us remember about El Reno, those of you who are thinking back to 2013, is that 4 very well-prepared, trained professional storm chasers who were monitoring and measuring tornadoes were killed in the El Reno, just the unprecedented tornado. And by the way, that's the first known deaths for any of these storm chasers that happened, and that's also in 2013. And so I would add year of tornado to anything that we're talking about. In fact, I will go beyond that. I will say more than just the year of the tornado. Actually, 2013 could be the year of the tornado swarm, which was introduced. It's an older term, but it became very much prominent if you'll search headlines for tornadoes for 2013. The tornado swarm outbreaks. And in fact, tornado swarms is where you have not just one tornado, but you have multiple tornadoes in a weather system over a very large geographic area. And in fact, the earliest swarm that I found was actually in January of 2013, which for many of us seems way too early for tornado season. So climate shifts certainly are planning here in terms of thinking about when is tornado season, when is hurricane season. 2013 gives us a lesson, and this one, of course, impacted a vast area of the U.S. Midwest and the U.S. South. There is no one zone, and in fact, one of the things that I would say, just looking at 2013, is that what we consider traditionally Tornado Alley is certainly the hotbed. It's the center of the bullseye, but that, you know, it's also now happening in places that are beyond that. So in May we have 3 separate of the swarms. They're really interesting to look at how they happen. If you don't have a redundant plan that can handle multiple alerts and multiple sirens in multiple places, this is the time to think about that. Hopefully that's Bill was chatting with you about when I was bumped offline. So in May, you've got the first swarm went across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Alabama. The second swarm was mostly in Oklahoma. And by the way, the second swarm in May is considered one of the most costly storm swarms. Is that a word, storm swarms? In U.S. history. It's just devastation wreaked. And of course, the third swarm went all the way from Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Michigan, and New York. There were 27 deaths reported to that particular swarm. But the deadliest occurred very late in the season. Again, it starts in January, goes to November. So what is tornado season anymore? This one broke out in the Midwest. The most devastation was in the state of Illinois. It's got the record as the deadliest storm, the most expensive storm. 73 individual tornadoes were confirmed across the Midwest that day. More than 100 people were injured, 11 were killed. Tornado swarms. 2013, you asked me what to remember, what to think about. Tornado swarms is one of those things. Let me talk about product safety recalls, and because I got bounced a bit, I'm a bit off time, so I'm going to make sure I get back and back to Bill. I had kind of, when I first thought I'd look back at 2013, it had sort of slipped off my radar screen that it was a year of product issues, and I decided to include this as the final category. And I'm just going to mention 3. There are more that happened that year. There was a European-wide milk recall, and the major controversy of this raged beginning in February and March of 2013. But there were reports of aflatoxins that occurred in the milk. They tried to recall the product. It was one of the most massive efforts trying to notify customers and recall the product that's ever been undertaken because the health risks were deemed that serious. For those of you who have a situation where you have to be prepared for that kind of incident notification, it's a very good case study to go back and look at the aflatoxin contamination and the efforts that worked and didn't work. And it's a great after-action review of trying, how do you do this? How do you not only get the products off the shelf, but products that people have purchased, products that have been used in other things? One of the serious issues were that a lot of the milk was not just shelf life milk, because shelf life, that's a limited time. A lot of it had been converted to powdered milk products that were in everything. Well, just amazing. It's in everything from different sports drinks mix, protein mixes, weight loss mixes, infant formula. It was complicated, and if you guys are looking for an on-site case study, if you have to have this in your crisis communication plans, it's an interesting one to look at. Another one involving dairy products was, of course, down under. Fonterra, which I believe is a New Zealand-based company, also had to undergo a massive product recall. They found botulism bacteria in the whey-based product they had used, and again, it was not just in, well, it was in cheeses and things like that, but it wasn't limited to that. They also found that they had sold it for use in multiple other products. And again, another great case study involving incident notification, trying to reach customers, suppliers, vendors, distributors, middle agents, stores, vendors, products, the media, the public, health officials. I mean, it's really very complication. And of course, the third one I wanted to put on here was, of course, the scandal in the United Kingdom over meat. Most of you remember the whole period. In fact, as I was trying to look back and trying to read some headlines about it, it doesn't appear to be resolved yet. There still are ripples of that in 2014, and it may go well into 2015. If you remember, the controversy is it was learned that products, not only like cuts of meat, ground meat, but finished products, lasagnas and beef stews and things, were either containing part or wholly horse meat rather than beef. And of course that creates other complications. And they found that other food than horse meat was also, once the investigation spread, they found, for example, pork was widely used in many products and labeled as beef. I mean, this has nutritional implications, it has dietary implications, it has people who are trying to, religious implications. There's so many levels of this beyond just the deceptive practices of it. And so it's a scandal. It's the only one I use a scandal for, and it involves communication, not only trying to get customers aware of this, and it's a massive communication undertaking, but also the idea of reputation management. As I said at the top of this, any of the things I found looking back at 2013 probably deserve their own full case study, and there's still so much more to learn from them. Let me make one other observation. I'll give you a couple of quick conclusions, and I'll rush you back to Bill, and I do appreciate your patience and time on this. The other thing about 2013 that I thought I'd mention wasn't a disaster or scandal or a natural flood or anything like that. In 2013, the U.S. Congress, of course, enacted the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act. And, you know, I'm going to mention this as an after-action review of 2013 because the Act amended the Public Health Service Act and basically expanded its mandate to require programs and efforts to better prepare the U.S. for a pandemic or a major health threat. Now, ironically enough, we sit here in 2014 with an entire thing just sort of that's been occupying our attention for the last few months on Ebola. And it was just a year ago that we said that basically we upped the ante. We raised the stakes for how well we're going to communicate. And I specifically point out some things in the Act, and I do think this actually is worth its own separate study sometime, case study, that the Act mandated more and more effective efforts for communicating risk, for ensuring public health information, for coordinating logistics, and providing specific behavioral information to key audiences. And if I were looking at this from a communication planning standpoint, one of the things I would learn from 2013 is that there is an expectation that we be better prepared to accomplish all of these, and how we're going to do it, when, to whom, still going back to the general principle of ensuring that our communication is effective, that we've chosen the right way to do it, the right time to do it, the right message to do it, the right people, and that we're monitoring and accountable for doing that. We're also understanding the kind of countervening things that are out there. And so I would include this act of Congress in 2013 that puts what we do and what we try to do effectively right at the center of Target Zero. So I'll throw that in as a freebie kind of thing. So lessons learned, and one of them is there's individual things in every one of these case studies, and if they are applicable to you, I encourage you to go back and do some homework and figure out, you know, what went right, what went wrong, what can I learn, because I might face something similar. But my general conclusions are preparedness remains king. What worked in some of the positive instances, whether it's the marathon finish line bombing or whether it's the success of dealing with warning messages and getting them out, or monitoring social media, the things that worked well were where people were prepared. And I think the range of things that happen basically remind us that threats can come at any time and anywhere. And we worry about JFK and Dulles and Washington National and Chicago O'Hare airports, but the Wichita airport was a targeted bombing. We say, how could this stuff affect us? Well, you know, shutting down a city for a pandemic, or having business disrupted because all the trains between New York and Toronto have been derailed or blown up. So preparedness remains king. We need to know as much as we can, be aware, informed, and be prepared to communicate to the right people at the right time, the right way, and having the right message for them. So I think that's probably takeaway number one. The second thing I would suggest in terms of takeaways is that 2013 basically offers you a template of incidents that you can certainly use to test and improve your plan. So if you say, well, Bob, what kinds of things should we test for, or what kind of scenarios? Well, I just gave you a very long, comprehensive list of the year of 2013, and it's not a bad place to say, how would we fare? Now, if you say, well, you know, we don't have any products, that's weird, to worry about communicating recall, then don't test that. But surely what we learned between criminal violence, terrorism, natural disasters, product issues, awareness issues, or even what's required for something like a pandemic by this act, all of them give you opportunities. I think that communication always can work. We can be better prepared, more effective, more efficient. We should test it, and we should fix the failures and continue to test it. And I say, you know, that's the way we innovate, and that's the way we improved. I think if you were to look at these disruptions and ask yourself, you know, if we were here, if we were in ground zero or zone 2 or zone 3, what would our plan be? How do we do it? What are your weak spots, and which ones are you going to address? And how are you going to boost your own resilience for these types of scenarios? And we put this note up here. You might look particularly here to look at tornado warnings. In fact, Moore, Oklahoma is a great example. They changed the warnings, the messages from the previous ones used, and they pilot tested them, and they found that the new evolved warning messages work better. So constant revision improves. There's a great article on Wikipedia. My students use it for all their term papers. But you can read about it. You can actually go look at the original sources that talk about it. There's a link on the screen of how these new improved tornado warning messages. So always revive them. There's a way to improve them, and it's one of the things that I like to mention in terms of our work. Quality information. Look, you can only communicate out based upon, what is it, garbage in, garbage out. There's a little saying here somewhere. You've got to be able to know what your information is reliable. You have to be aware. You have to monitor it. You've got to be able to communicate that understanding. You have to work to shape your messages so that people can not only understand them, comprehend them, but they can give them behavioral guidance. And I think the example I just ended with changing tornado warnings in Moore, Oklahoma saves lives is a beautiful thing for an after-action review and a case study, and I think we want to improve the quality. The other thing that we've learned, particularly with disaster after disaster in the same place, is that redundancy and resiliency are still important parts of being prepared. You've got to have adaptable and flexible plans that can manage and function during everything from power outages to systemic disruptions to floods to winds. Plans have to be able to scale up or down, and as we learned in 2013, we've learned it now that we learned it at Fukushima, we learned it everywhere else, it's often just not one disaster, it's a series of them, and you can't just have plan A for the first one, otherwise you end up as Bohol, where you're in the middle of responding to an earthquake and suddenly you're hit by an overwhelmingly devastating typhoon. I mean, does it? I mean, I mean, if I were there, I know that there'd be a disaster fatigue going on, and I don't know what's next. I don't know if it's a disease outbreak or what, but the idea of being prepared at multiple levels, multiple redundancies is as important as ever. And the final thing is that I think you have to continue to learn, to study. I think that what we're doing today is part of that. I think recognizing, and I think picking 2013 is perfectly appropriate, and I think 2014 would be too when we get around to that. But you also have to begin your core knowledge, and you have to get people looking at systems, choices, options, tools, so that they understand them prior to an event. It makes no sense to wait for it to happen to you. And I don't care if it's an active shooter or an active terrorism or disease outbreak or just this coming influenza season, which apparently now we've learned the flu shot was misaligned, so we may have a little bumpy influenza season coming. Are you ready? That's about as direct as I can be. You can't figure it out. You can't do the make it up as you go along thing. You've got to begin to do it. And so prepare, educate, train is the things to do. Apologize for the looping around here. Let me see if we can, Bill, I apologize to you because you got started and then we pulled it back, so we'll try to work through that. So let me bounce it back to you guys, and I'll be here, but we'll still wrap up for the Q&A, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I'm very glad that you had the chance to go through and see what's happening. Let's talk a little bit, just a quick review. We talked about preparedness is king, one of the keys that he did, and I've got to stress again, be ready. As Dr. Chandler said, this is not something you can do to seat of the pants. You don't want to put your people through that in the middle of a crisis and then be prepared for the incidents, have templates that are there, be prepared for your messages. And again, I suggest strongly read Dr. Chandler's book. That's there are notifications. It helps with the message mapping and letting you know how to be ready. We talk about tornadoes. I'm in Massachusetts. That's where I'm based. And we don't get tornadoes, but we did. So it's critical to be ready for a lot that's going on, and things are changing. Second part that I think is important is reporting. Dr. Chandler said you report for continuous improvement. And for a lot of us, we've got the koan about the fact that if you can't manage it, excuse me, if you can't manage it, you can't fix it. 1 second. So I want to stress, get reports that are there. We talked about the after reporting that's going to be done. There are things that you can do manually, but there are things that you should be able to get from the system as well. What's going on while your messages are going out? It's not a time to be sitting there and just have a, forgive the expression, but a black hole where you don't know what's occurring and taking place. You want to see what's happening while it's occurring. And then in an after action reporting, that's where you can begin to take a look at how successful were we? How many messages went out? What failed? Now, hopefully in your testing, as Dr. Chandler also said, you'll bump into a lot of these and eliminate them. But the idea is to be able to have some hard metrics that you can look at that comes from it that you can then feed back in to make your process better and to provide others who want to know how successful your process was when they're looking for the compliance and making sure that you're reaching what you said you would. Okay. Second, communicate quality information. That's critical. How do you get more information? There are a lot of things that you'll get from your sources, but social media is a source as well. One of the things I had read about was there was a riot that was occurring in the UK, and the police were on the social media at all times. They were gathering information and responding to it. They even used the social media to be able to get people to be helped. Will you help us clean up this area? Will you help us work out different parts of what's being set up? All these things were taking place while this was occurring. Different ways that you can do that. You know, you can filter Twitter and see what's there and determine, is this correct? Is this a rumor that we've got to worry about? Is this information we can use, or is it false that's there? You can have devices for your members to be able to use. We've got mobile member as an example, but then they can get push information to it, but also they can push back images. They can push back information from the scene and let you know what takes place, as well as letting you know what condition they're in. Weather information with weather alerts. Network is a little different, where it allows multiple institutions or organizations to be able to see each other's messages. When you do that, you can make sure that you're not overstepping or causing a problem with someone else. If one of the police groups says this is our staging area, you don't want to tell them that's the place that you want all the public to gather. So it's important to make sure that they can see this information and be able to pick it up. Right? And one of the other ones that we've got is NC4. Okay, and we call it Threat View. And the idea now is that I can see threats on a map and also have those tied to alerts. So if a particular threat is picked up by NC4, I can take that information and I can now have a threat automatically be sent out. Dr. Chandler talked about things that occurred in India, in Japan, and for some they might be saying, well, why would I care? Well, one of the key things would be, what if you've got people there? What if you have a school that's got a trip that goes to Jamaica and there's a hurricane coming in? What happens if you're running an organization somewhere? All those are things that I've got to be concerned about. And that NC4 Threat View allows me to see that information and act on it as it comes in. And they provide a lot of different variety of information that's there. But the same sort of thing, quality information that I can use to know what's happening. And finally, education on the system. We try to provide 7x24 training with an LMS, any place, any pace, with the idea being you've got to continually train people. You've got to make sure that they're still up to speed that's there. We try to make it 10 minutes or less because a lot of people have very small spans. They can stick something in for 10 minutes, but a 2-hour video might be too long for them. So we try to make it short for them to see it. Role-based or feature-based. So if it's a role, here's what you do. If it's a feature, here's how you handle it. And quizzes, certifications, and most importantly was reporting. Reporting is absolutely critical to people. Managers want to know, do they know the information? Have they seen it? And when was the last time they looked? And you have reports for that. With that, let me pass Q&A back and let Michael take over from there.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Dr. Chandler. At this time, we're going to move on to the Q&A session. As a reminder, you may submit your questions by typing a question into the open text field in the questions panel on your screen and submitting it to all panelists. We will answer as many questions as we can. And let's begin with our first question. This one's actually directed towards Bill. Bill, if there, with Everbridge, if there's an impending storm, or for example, you see a tornado forming, and you are nowhere near your office or your desk, is there a way you can send a message letting employees, staff, or if you're in the government, let residents know of the impending storm?
Yes, you've got mobile tools that you can use wherever you are. As long as you've got access to your mobile network, you've got the ability to send that information across and then expand it out and take care of other information.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Dr. Chandler. Dr. Chandler, we have a question. Speaking of 2014, was there any events in particular, 1 or 2 events, that stuck out in your mind where we can build and learn a lot and build communication plans for?
Well, I mean, 2014, you have a whole other year of stuff to pick from. What I did for doing the 2013 was try to go through and look at all the events and decide which ones had the best sort of individual case studies. I mean, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought through 2014. There's so many different things that happen. I mean, obviously, the health communication stuff is, I think, dominant in my head at this point with Ebola. and the information that's just been released predicting this to be a much higher than ordinary influenza season. And so 2014 certainly brings us to mind about behaviors, rumor control, and those sorts of things. I think the report that the FBI released that I mentioned during the session, that the incidences of workplace violence and mass shootings and active shooters is statistically trending upwards. It's not just that they get covered more. And I think that kind of physical safety and concern deserves coming back full circle. Of course, the headlines, my immediate stuff on 2014 is to look at the scandals and the reputation disasters, and whether it's the NFL or General Motors with their product recall stuff. I mean, I have a feeling there's plenty to pull on for 2014 for lessons learned about things that those of us that are trying to communicate about all of these different areas, could certainly do. And the natural disasters. I mean, this has been yet another year of everything from wildfires earlier in the year in the dry season to various things, the ferry boat sinking. There's a lot of things. You got my head spinning. I think it'd be useful, and maybe we'll come back at some point and do the same thing for 2014 we did for 2013, because I think there is value at looking at all these events, or particularly those that we think that might pertain to us, and try to figure out what worked, what didn't, why, and how we can improve from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Chandler. In respect to everyone's time, we want to get to our last question. As a reminder, we will be answering questions afterwards. We'll try and get to everyone's via email or through, for our customers, through our account managers. So our last question comes from Patrick Douglas. And Bill, this is for you. What actions can you take to assist special needs and low-income individuals in regards to ensuring messages are delivered and appropriately understood?
Okay, let me suggest a couple of things. One is, if you have opt-in portals, this is a great place to have the ability to say, if you need special assistance, if you have a wheelchair and you have to move, if you're more elderly and need to have support services, please let us know. Check off these boxes, and we'll send you information based on that. You also, when you're going out to let people know about what you've got available, like an opt-in, to build the database, the contact database you're going to send, make sure you hit the different, I don't want to say old age homes, but different places that you can reach the people who need this kind of information. A lot of times you can get help from groups like the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts that are there, who will be able to go building to building to set up. One of the communities worked with the local churches, synagogues, mosques that were there to contact the people there where they felt more trust. Low income and people who have immigrated to the country, you have a natural fear. So letting them know that there is still a way that they can be involved, get messages sent to them via SMS or to emails that can seem more anonymous, might get them involved and set up also. I'll open this also to Dr. Chandler. Do you have suggestions, Doctor?
Well, I think understanding who your audience is first and foremost. So you have to know you have special needs or technology disadvantaged or low income or whatever was implied in the question. So audience analysis. 2, work in advance to figure that out. Bill's giving you a great example of using the system to allow people to have data inputted in to adjust the messages. If you need to send something out, TDD or TDY, if you need to send out messages for the visually impaired, if you need to send messages out for audio impaired, if you need, I mean, all of these things, you have to know who you're trying to communicate with, and you have to have audience demographics, and you have to have audience analysis. And then I think you have to begin to think in a much more sophisticated level. So you say someone who has different education levels, for example. Well, they're going to read messages differently. I think you have to target it. I think you have to do things that change a message. And yes, you want to simplify all messages. You want them as simple as possible. You want them positioned as much as possible. In fact, you want to advance education. And to try to get out there. I also think you have to establish a connection. People need to know, because I think part of special needs individuals is their recognition that you are making an effort to accommodate them, and I think that's part of it. And finally, I mean, there's not more I could say, but let me end with, and I think that you have to assess your success at doing it. I think you need to audit how well prepared you are for the special needs. And I mean, folks like Bill and the folks here, I think they can help you use the tools and systems, but ultimately you have to take responsibility of have you taken steps to ensure that any special needs audience is reachable, it gets a message that they can both comprehend and understand and pay attention to, and that they're able to comply with behavioral requests, and that it properly motivates them. And I think that comes only through lots of assessments.
Thank you, Dr. Chandler. I'm very sorry to announce that we've unfortunately run out of time. Again, thank you to Dr. Chandler and Bill Shera for a great session, and to all of our attendees who were able to join us today. If you missed any part of the webinar, be sure to look for the slides on everbridge.com/blog. You will also receive an email with a link to the recording in the coming days. If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us on Twitter @Everbridge and join our groups on LinkedIn, Everbridge Incident Management, and Everbridge Notification Professionals. For those of you interested in requesting a demo of the new Everbridge system, please visit everbridge.com/request-demo. And I'd also like to mention, for those of you who are interested in seeing an upcoming Expert Insights webinar, we will have one this upcoming Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, focusing on department coordination through critical communication systems. Thank you all again for your participation in today's Expert Insights webinar, After Action Report, 5 Lessons Learned from the Events of 2013. We hope to see you all online again soon. Have a great day, everyone.